But this records to wherever SAS records things, and I don't have to know anything about it. Very good. Well, it's that magic hour. Welcome y'all to another week. More than halfway through the book A Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K. For our ever briefing recaps, Chapter 1, Warriors in the Mist, we met our young protagonist, Ged, a boy with wizarding ways. Things happened. He saved his town. He encountered a shadow when he was prideful, and then he went to school. He went to a school for the wizards on the island of Roke. It was mostly amazing, sometimes hard. He had a friend and kind of an enemy, and then he did a really kind of not very smart thing. And then bad things happened and people died. Then he went on to be a wizard, and but the bad thing was chasing him. There was a shadow, and it was bad. So he went and he protected a little, I don't know what it is, city-state? This, can't remember what it's called. The not the Lonely Island. Some isles or islets or something, some little towns. He went and protected them from the Dragon of Pendor. Bested the dragon and all of the dragon's offspring. But then was hunted and didn't know where to go, and the shadow's chasing him, and it's bad news bears. And he went on a boat. He went to Oskill. He kind of was being driven there. Turns out there was an ancient power locked in a stone. Turns out maybe ancient powers aren't good things. I don't know. In this case, at least, maybe. And then his erstwhile friend from Gaunt ended up eaten by weird evil things. And then he turned into a hawk and he took off. Right. And we left off dramatically. We took off with, quick as he had once done on Roke, Ged took the shape of a great hawk, not the sparrow hawk they called him, but the pilgrim falcon that flies like an arrow, like thought. And then he flew like an arrow, like thought. The creatures of stone circled while croaking one by one, beat back ponderously inland over the moors. The old powers will not cross over the sea, being bound each to an isle, a certain place, cave or stone or welling spring. But Ged went on, falcon-winged, falcon mad, like an unfalling arrow, like an unforgotten thought, over the Oskill Sea and eastward into the wind of winter and the night. That was a dramatic stopping off at one point. I should get hired to write for Friends or something. All right. Starting our new reading for this evening. Ogion the Silent had come home late to Rialbi from his autumn wanderings. More silent, more solitary than ever he had become as the years went on. The new Lord of Gaunt, down in the city below, had never got a word out of him, though he had climbed clear up to the Falcon's Nest to seek help of the mage in a certain pyritic venture towards the Andrades. Ogion, who spoke to spiders on their webs and had been seen to greet trees courteously, never said a word to the Lord of the Isle, who went away discontented. There was perhaps some discontent or unease also in Ogion's mind, for he had spent all summer and autumn alone up on the mountain, and only now near sun return was come back to his hearthside. The morning after his return he rose late, and wanting a cup of rush-wash tea, he went out to fetch water from the spring that ran a little way down the hillside from his house. The margins of the spring's small lively pool were frozen, and the sere moss among the rocks was traced with flowers of frost. It was broad daylight, but the sun would not clear the mighty shoulder of the mountain for an hour yet. All of western Gaunt, from the sea beaches to the peak, was sunless, silent, and clear in the winter morning. As the mage stood by the spring, looking out over the falling lands and the harbor and the gray distances of the sea, wings beat above him. He looked up, raising one arm a little. A great hawk came down with loud beating wings and lighted on his wrist. Like a trained hunting bird, it clung there, but it wore no broken leash, no band or bell. The claws dug hard in Ogion's wrist. The barred wings trembled. The round gold eye was dull and wild. "Are you messenger or message?" Ogion said gently to the hawk. "Come on with me." As he spoke, the hawk looked at him. Ogion was silent a minute. "I named you once, I think," he said, and then strode to his house and entered, bearing the bird still on his wrist. He made the hawk stand on the hearth in the fire's heat and offered it water. It would not drink. Then Ogion began to lay a spell very quietly, weaving the web of magic with his hands more than with words. When the spell was whole and woven, he said softly, "Ged," not looking at the falcon on the hearth. He waited some while, then turned and got up and went to the young man who stood trembling and dull-eyed before the fire. Ged was richly and outlandishly dressed in fur and silk and silver, but the clothes were torn and stiff with sea salt, and he stood gaunt and stooped, his hair lank about his scarred face. Ogion took the soiled, princely cloak off his shoulders, led him to the alcove room where his prentice had slept, and made him lie down on the pallet there, and with so a murmured sleeping charm left him. He had said no word to him, knowing that Ged had no human speech in him now. As a boy, Ogion, like all boys, had thought it would be a very pleasant game to take by art magic whatever shape one liked, man or beast, tree or cloud, and to so play at 1,000 things. But as a wizard, he had learned the price of the game, which is the peril of losing one's self, playing away the truth. The longer a man stays in a form not his own, the greater his peril. Every prentice sorcerer learns of the tale of the wizard Bordger of Way, who delighted in taking bear's shape, and did so more and more often until the bear grew in him and the man died away, and he became a bear and killed his own little son in the forests and was hunted down and slain. And no one knows how many of the dolphins that leap in the waters of the inmost sea were once men, wise men, who forgot their wisdom, and in the name of and who forgot wise men who forgot their wisdom and their name in the joy of the restless sea. Ged had taken hawk shape in fierce distress and rage, and when he flew from Oskell, there had been but one thought in his mind, to outfly both stone and shadow, to escape the cold, treacherous lands, to go home. The falcon's anger and wildness were like his own, and had become his own, and his will to fly had become the falcon's will. Thus he had passed over Enlad, swooping down to drink at a lonely forest pool, but on the wing again at once, driven by fear of the shadow that came behind him. So he had crossed the great sea lane called the Jaws of Enlad, and gone on, east by south, the hills of Oriane faint to his right, and the hills of Andrad fainter to his left, and before him only the sea. At last, ahead, there rose up out of the waves one unchanging wave, towering always higher, the white peak of Gaunt. In all the sunlight and the dark of that great flight, he had worn the falcon's wings and looked through the falcon's eyes, and forgetting his own thoughts, he had known at last only what the falcon knows: hunger, the wind, the way he flies. He flew to the right haven. There were few on Roke, and only one on Gaunt who could have made him back into a man. He was savage and silent when he woke. Ogion never spoke to him, but gave him meat and water and let him sit hunched by the fire, grim as a great weary sulking hawk. When night came, he slept. On the third morning, he came into the fireside where the mage sat gazing at the flames and said, "Master." "Welcome, lad," said Ogion. Oh, good. Back with y'all. So sorry. I was just checking the Zoom chat and realized for a minute I was needing to be, I'm supposed to be pretending to be sass. Welcome, lad, said Ogion. I have come back to you as I left. A fool, the young man said, his voice harsh and thickened. The mage smiled a little and motioned Ged to sit across the hearth from him and set to brewing them some tea. Snow was falling, the first of the winter here on the lower slopes of Gaunt. Ogion's windows were shuttered fast, but they could hear the wet snow as it fell soft on the roof, and the deep stillness of snow all about the house. A long time they sat there by the fire, and Ged told his old master the tale of the years since he had sailed from Gaunt aboard the ship called Shadow. Ogion asked no questions, and when Ged was done, he kept silent for a long time, calm, pondering. Then he rose and set out bread and cheese and wine on the table, and they ate together. When they had done and had set the room straight, Ogion spoke. "Those are bitter scars you bear, lad," he said. "I have no strength against the thing," Ged answered. Ogion shook his head, but said no more for a time. At length, "Strange," he said. "You had strength enough to outspell a sorcerer in his own domain, there in Oskill. You had strength enough to withstand the lures, and fend off the attack of the servants of an old power of earth. And at Pendor, you had strength enough to stand up to a dragon." "It was luck I had in Oskill, not strength," Ged replied, and he shivered again as he thought of the dreamlike, deathly cold of the court of the Terranon. "As for the dragon, I knew his name. The evil thing, the shadow that haunts me, has no name." "All things have a name," said Ogion, so certainly that Ged dared not repeat what the Archmage Genscher had told him, that such evil forces as he loosed were nameless. The dragon of Pendor, indeed, had offered to tell him the shadow's name, but he put little trust in that offer, nor did he believe Seret's promise that the stone would tell him what he needed to know. "If the shadow has a name," he said at last, "I do not think it will stop and tell it to me." "No," said Ogion, nor have you stopped and told it your name, and yet it knew it. On the moors in Oskill, it called you by your name, the name I gave you. It is strange, strange." He fell to brooding again. At last Ged said, "I came here for counsel, not refuge, master. I will not bring the shadow upon you, and it will soon be here if I stay. Once you drove it from this very room. No, that was but the foreboding of it, the shadow of a shadow. I could not drive it forth now. Only you could do that. But I am powerless before it. Is there any place? His voice died before he had asked the question. There is no safe place, Ogion said grimly. Do not transform yourself again, Ged. The shadow seeks to destroy your true being. It nearly did so, driving you into the hawk's being. No, where you should go, I do not know. Yet I have an idea of what you should do. It is a hard thing to say to you. Ged's silence demanded truth, and Ogion said at last, You must turn around. Turn around? If you go ahead, you keep running. Wherever you run, you will meet danger and evil, for it drives you. It chooses the way you go. You must choose. You must seek what seeks you. You must hunt the hunter. Ged said nothing. At the spring of the river R, I named you, the mage said, a stream that falls from the mountain to the sea. A man would know the end he goes to, but he cannot know if he does not turn and return to his beginning, and then hold that beginning in his being. If he would not be a stick whirled and whelmed in the stream, he must be the stream itself, all of it, from its spring to its sinking in the sea. You return to Gaunt. You return to me, Ged. Now turn clear round and seek the very source and that which lies before the source. There lies your hope of strength. There, master? Ged said with terror in his voice. Where? Ogion did not answer. If I turn, Ged said, after some time had gone by, if, as you say, I hunt the hunter, I think the hunt will not be long. All its desire is to meet me face to face, and twice it has done so, and twice defeated me. Third time's the charm, said Ogion. Ged paced the room up and down, from fireside to door, from door to fireside. And if it defeats me wholly, he said, arguing perhaps with Ogion, perhaps with himself, it will take my knowledge and my power and use them. It threatens only me now. But if it enters into me and possesses me, it will work great evil through me. That is true. If it defeats you. Yet, if I run again, it will as surely find me again, and all my strength is spent. And all my strength is spent in the running. Ged paced on a while, then suddenly turned, and kneeling down before the mage, he said, I have walked with great wizards, and I have lived on the Isle of the Wise, but you are my true master, Ogion. He spoke with love and with a somber joy. Good, said Ogion. Now you know it. Better now than never. But you will be my master in the end. He got up and built up the fire to a good blaze and hung the kettle over it to boil. Then, pulling on his sheepskin coat, said, I must go look after my goats. Watch the kettle for me, lad. When he came back in, all snow-powdered and stamping snow from his goatskin boots, he carried a long, rough shaft of yew wood. All the end of the short afternoon, and again after their supper, he sat working by lamp fire on the shaft with knife and rubbing stone and spellcraft. Many times he passed his hands along the wood as if seeking any flaw. Often, as he worked, he sang softly. Ged, still weary, listened, and as he grew sleepy, He thought himself a child in the witch's hut in Ten Alders village, on a snowy night, in the firelit dark, the air heavy with herb scent and smoke, and his mind all adrift on dreams as he listened to the long, soft singing of spells and deeds of heroes who fought against dark powers and won, or lost, on distant islands long ago. There, said Ogion, and handed the finished staff to him. The Archmage gave you yew wood, a good choice, and I kept to it. I meant the shaft for a longbow, but it's better this way. Good night, my son. As Ged, who found no words to thank him, turned away to his alcove room, Ogion watched him and said too softly for Ged to hear, "Oh, my young falcon, fly well." In the cold dawn when Ogion woke, Ged was gone. Only he had left in wizardly fashion a message of silver-scrawled runes on the hearthstone that faded even as Ogion read them. "Master, I go hunting." Dun, dun, dun. Which brings us to Chapter 8, aptly titled Hunting. Ged had set off down the road from Rialbi in the winter dark before sunrise, and before noon he came to the port of Gaunt. Ogion had given him decent Gauntish leggings and shirt, and vest of leather and linen to replace his Oscilian finery. But Ged had kept for his winter journey the lordly cloak lined with Palawi fur. So cloaked, empty-handed but for the dark staff that matched his height, he came to the land gate, and the soldiers lounging against the carven dragons there did not have to look twice at him to see the wizard. They drew aside their lances and let him enter without question, and watched him as he went down the street. On the quays and in the houses of the Sea Guild, he asked for ships that might be going out north or west to Enlod, Andrad, Oriane. All answered him that no ship would be leaving Gauntport now, so near sun return. And at the Sea Guild they told him that even fishing boats were not going out through the armed cliffs in the untrusty weather. They offered him dinner at the buttery there in the Sea Guild. The wizard seldom has to ask for his dinner. He sat a while there with those longshoremen, shipwrights, and weather workers, taking pleasure in their slow, sparse conversation, their grumbling, Gauntish speech. There was a great wish in him to stay here on Gaunt, forgoing all wizardry and venture, forgetting all power and horror, to live in peace like any man on the known, dear ground of his homeland. That was his wish, but his will was other. He did not stay long in the Sea Guild, nor in the city, after he found there would be no ships out of port. He set out walking along the bay shore till he came to the first of the small villages that lie north of the city of Gaunt, and there he asked among the fishermen till he found one that had a boat to sell. The fisherman was a dour old man. His boat, 12 foot long and clinker built, was so warped and sprung as to be scarce seaworthy, yet he asked a high price for her. The spell of sea safety for a year laid on his own boat, himself, and his son. For Gauntish fishermen fear nothing, not even wizards, only the sea. The spell of sea safety, which is set, that spell of sea safety, which is set much store by in the northern archipelago, never saved a man from storm wind or storm wave, but cast by one who knows the local seas and the ways of a boat and the skills of the sailor. It weaves some daily safety about the fisherman. Ged made the charm well and honestly, working on it all that night and the next day, omitting nothing, sure and patient, though all the while his mind was strained with fear, and his thoughts went on dark paths seeking to imagine how the shadow would appear to him next, and how soon, and where. When the spell was made whole and cast, he was very weary. He slept that night in the fisherman's hut, in a whale-gut hammock, and got up at dawn smelling like a dried herring, and went down to the cove under Cut North Cliff, where his new boat lay. He pushed it into the quiet water by the landing, and water began to well softly into it at once. Stepping into the boat, light as a cat, Ged set straight the warped boards and rotten pegs, worked both with tools and incantations, as he had used to do with Petbury in Low Torning. That was the name of the town. The people of the village gathered in silence, not too close, to watch his quick hands and listen to his soft voice. This job, too, he did well and patiently until it was done and the boat was sealed and sound. Then he set up his staff that Ogian had made for him a mast, stayed it with spells, and fixed across it a yard of sound wood. Downward from this wove, he wove on the wind's loom a sail of spells, a square sail, white as the snows on Gaunt Peak above. At this, the women watching sighed with envy. Then, standing by the mast, Ged raised up the mage wind lightly. The boat moved out upon the water, turning towards the armed cliffs across the great bay. When the silent, watching fisherman saw that leaky rowboat slip out under sail, as quick and neat as a sandpiper taking wing, then they raised a cheer, grinning and stomping in the cold wind on the beach, and Ged, looking back a moment, saw them there, cheering him on, under the dark bulk of Cut North Cliff, above which the snowy fields of the mountain rose up into cloud. He sailed across the bay and out between the armed cliffs and onto the Gauntish Sea, there setting his course northwestwards to pass north of Oriane, returning as he had come. He had no plan or strategy in this, but the retracing of his course, following his falcon flight across the days and winds from Oskill. The shadow might wander, or it might come straight. There was no telling. But unless it had withdrawn again wholly into the dream realm, it should not miss Ged coming openly over open sea to meet it. On the sea, he wished to meet it, if meet it he must. He was not sure why this was, yet he had a terror of meeting the thing again on dry land. Out of the sea there rise storms and monsters, but no evil powers. Evil is of earth. And there is no sea, no running of river or spring in the dark land where once Ged had gone. Death is the dry place, though the sea itself was a danger to him in the hard weather of the season. That danger and change and instability seemed to him a defense and chance. And when he met the shadow in this final end of his folly, he thought, maybe at least he could grip the thing even as it gripped him, and drag it with the weight of his body and the weight of his own death down into the darkness of the deep sea, from which, so held, it might not rise again. So at least his death would put an end to the evil he had loosed by living. He sailed a rough chopping sea above which clouds drooped and drifted in vast mournful veils. He raised no mage wind now, now, but used the world's wind, which blew keen from the northwest. And so long as he maintained the substance of his spell-woven sail, often with a whispered word, the sail itself set and turned itself to catch the wind. Had he not used the magic, he would have been hard put to keep the crank little boat on such a course on that rough sea. On he went, and kept keen lookout on all sides. The fisherman's wife had given him 2 loaves of bread and a jar of water, and after some hours, when he was first in sight of Camabar Rock, the only isle between Gaunt and Oriana, he ate and drank, and thought gratefully of the silent Gauntish woman who had given him the food. On past the dim glimpse of land he sailed, tacking more westly now, in a faint dank drizzle that overland might be a light snow. There was no sound at all but the small creaking of the boat and the light slap of the waves on her bow. No boat or bird went by. Nothing moved but the ever-moving water and the drifting clouds, the clouds that he remembered dimly as flowing all about him as he, a falcon, flew east on this same course as he now followed to the west. And he had looked down on the gray sea then, as now he looked up at the gray air. Nothing was ahead when he looked around. He stood up, chilled, weary of the gazing and peering into empty murk. Come then, he muttered. Come on. What do you wait for, shadow? There was no answer, no darker motion among the dark mists and waves. Yet he knew more and more surely now that the thing was not far off, seeking blindly down his cold trail. And all at once he shouted out aloud, I am here! I, Ged the Sparrowhawk, and I summon my shadow! The boat creaked, the waves lisped, and the wind hissed a little on the white sail. The moments went by. Still Ged waited, one hand on the yew-wood mast of the boat, staring into the icy drizzle that slowly drove in ragged lines across the sea from the north. The moments went by. Then, far off in the rain over the water, he saw the shadow coming. It had done with the body of the Oscilian oarsman, Skior, and not as Gebeth did it follow him through the winds and over sea, nor did he wear that beast shape in which he had seen it on Roke Knoll and in his dreams. Yet it had a shape now, even in the daylight. In its pursuit of Ged and in its struggle with him on the moors, it had drawn power from him, sucking it into itself. And it may be that his summoning of it, aloud in the light of day, had given to it or forced upon it some form and semblance. Certainly it had now some likeness to a man, though being shadow, it cast no shadow. So it came over the sea, out of the jaws of Enlod towards Gaunt, a dim, ill-made thing pacing uneasily upon the waves, peering down the wind as it came, and the cold rain blew through it. Because it was half blinded by the day, and because he had called it, Ged saw it before it saw him. He knew it as it knew him, among all beings, all shadows. In the terrible solitude of the winter sea, Ged stood and saw the thing he feared. The wind seemed to blow it farther from the boat, and the waves ran under it, bewildering his eye, and ever and again it seemed closer to him. He could not tell if it moved or not. It had seen him now. Though there was nothing in his mind but horror and fear of its touch, the cold black pain that drained his life away, yet he waited, unmoving. Then, all at once, speaking aloud, he called the mage wind strong and sudden into his white sail, and his boat leapt across the gray waves straight at the lowering thing that hung upon the wind. In utter silence, the shadow, wavering, turned and fled. Upwind it went, northward. Upwind Ged's boat followed, shadow speed against mage craft, the rainy gale against them both. And the young man yelled to his boat, to the sail and the wind and the waves ahead, as a hunter yells to his hounds when the wolf runs in plain sight before them. And he brought into the spell-woven sail a wind that would have split any sail of cloth, and drove his boat over the sea like a scud of blown foam, closer always to the thing that fled. Now the shadow turned, making a half circle, and appearing all at once more loose and dim, less like a man, more like mere smoke blowing on the wind. It doubled back and ran downwind with the gale, as if it made for Gaunt. With hand and spell, Ged turned his boat, and it leaped like a dolphin from the water, rolling in that quick turn. Faster than before he followed, but the shadow grew ever fainter to his eyes. Rain, mixed with sleet and snow, came stinging across his back and his left cheek, and he could not see more than 100 yards ahead. Before long, as the storm grew heavier, the shadow was lost to sight. Yet Ged was sure of its track, as if he followed a beast's track over snow, instead of a wraith fleeing over water. Though the wind blew his way now, he held the singing mage wind in the sail, and flake foam shot from the boat's blunt prow, and she slapped the water as she went. For a long time, hunted and hunter held their weird, fleet course, and the day was darkening fast. Ged knew that at the great pace he had gone these past hours, he must be south of Gaunt, heading past it towards Spevey or Torhaven, or even past these islands out into the open reach. He could not tell. He did not care. He hunted. He followed, and fear ran before him. All at once, he saw the shadow for a moment, not far from him. The world's wind had been sinking, and the driving sleet of the storm had given way to a chill, ragged, thickening mist. Through this mist he glimpsed the shadow, fleeing somewhat to the right of his course. He spoke to the wind and sail, and turned the tiller and pursued, though again it was a blind pursuit. The fog thickened fast, boiling and tattering where it met the spell wind, closing down all round the boat, a featureless pallor that deadened light and sight. Even as Ged spoke the first word of a clearing charm, he saw the shadow again, still to the right of his course, but very near and going slowly. The fog blew through the faceless vagueness of its head, yet it was shaped like a man, only deformed and changing, like a man's shadow. Ged veered the boat once more, thinking he had run his enemy to ground. In that instant, it vanished, and it was his boat that ran aground, smashing up on shoal rocks that the blowing mist had hidden from his sight. He was pitched nearly out, but grabbed hold of the mast staff before the next breaker struck. This was a great wave, which threw the little boat up out of the water and brought her down on a rock, as a man might lift up and crush a snail's shell. Stout and wizardly was the staff Ogion had shaped. It did not break, and buoyant as a dry log, it rode the water. Still grasping it, Ged was pulled back as the breakers streamed back from the shoal, so that he was in deep water and saved till the next wave from battering on the rocks. Salt blinded and choked, he tried to keep his head up and to fight the enormous pull of the sea. There was a sand beach a little aside of the rocks. He glimpsed this a couple of times as he tried to swim free of the rising of the next breaker. With all his strength and with the staff's power aiding him, he struggled to make for the beach. He got no nearer. The surge and recoil of the swells tossed him back and forth like a rag, and the cold of the deep sea drew warmth fast from his body, weakening him till he could not move his arms. He had lost sight of rocks and beach alike, and did not know what way he faced. There was only a tumult of water around him, under him, over him, blinding him, strangling him, drowning him. A wave swelling in under the ragged fog took him and rolled him over and flung him up like a stick of driftwood on the sand. There he lay. He still clutched the yew-wood staff with both hands. Lesser waves dragged at him, trying to tug him back down the sand in their outgoing rush, and the mist parted and closed above him, and later a sleety rain beat on him. After a long time he moved. He got up on his hands and knees and began slowly crawling up the beach, away from the water's edge. It was a black night now, but he whispered to the staff, and a little wear-light clung about it. Oh, excuse me. With this to guide him, he struggled forward, little by little, up toward the dunes. He was so beaten and broken and cold that this crawling through the wet sand and the whistling, sea-thundering dark was the hardest thing he had ever had to do. And once or twice it seemed to him that the great noise of the sea and the wind all died away, and the wet sand turned to dust under his hands, and he felt the unmoving gaze of strange stars on his back. But he did not lift his head, and he crawled on, and after a while he heard his own gasping breath and felt the bitter wind beat the rain against his face. The morning brought a little warmth back into him at last, and after he had crept up onto the dunes, where the gusts of rainy wind came less hard, he managed to get up on his feet. He spoke a stronger light out of the staff, for the world was utterly black, and then leaning on the staff, he went on, stumbling and halting, half a mile or so inland. Then on the rise of a dune he heard the sea, louder again, not behind him, but in front. The dunes sloped down again to another shore. This was no island he was on, but a mere reef, a bit of sand in the midst of the ocean. He was too worn out to despair, but he gave a kind of sob and stood there bewildered, leaning on his staff for a long time. Then doggedly he turned to the left, so the wind would be at his back at least, and shuffled down the high dune, seeking some hollow among the ice-rimmed, bowing seagrass, where he could have a little shelter. As he held up the staff to see what lay before him, he caught a dull gleam at the farthest edge of the circle of wear-light, a wall of rain-wet wood. It was a hut or shed, small and rickety as if a child had built it. Ged knocked on the low door with his staff. It remained shut. Ged pushed it open and entered, stooping nearly double to do so. He could not stand up straight inside the hut. Coals lay red in the fire pit, and in their dim glow, Ged saw a man with long white hair, who crouched in terror against the far wall, and another, man or woman he could not tell, peering from a heap of rags or hides on the floor. I won't hurt you, Ged whispered. They said nothing. He looked from one to the other. Their eyes were blank with terror. When he laid down his staff, the one under the pile of rags hid, whimpering. Ged took off his cloak. It was heavy with water and ice, stripped naked, and huddled over the fire pit. Give me something to wrap myself in, he said. He was hoarse and could hardly speak for the chattering of his teeth and the long shudders that shook him. If they heard him, neither of the old ones answered. He reached out and took a rag from the bed heap. A goat hide, it might have been years ago, but now it was all tatters and black grease. The one under the bed heap moaned with fear, but Ged paid no heed. He rubbed himself dry and then whispered, Have you wood? Build up the fire a little, old man. I came to you in need. I mean you no harm. The old man did not move, watching him in a stupor of fear. Do you understand me? Do you speak no Hardic? Ged paused and then asked, Kargad? At that word, the old man nodded all at once, one nod, like a sad old puppet on strings. But as it was the only word Ged knew of the Kargish language, it was the end of their conversation. He found wood piled up by one wall, built up the fire himself, and then with gestures asked for water, for swallowing seawater had sickened him, and now he was parched with thirst. Cringing, the old man pointed to a great shell that held water, and pushed towards the fire another shell in which were strips of smoked dried fish. So, cross-legged by the fire, Ged drank and ate a little, and as some strength and sense began to come back into him, he wondered where he was. Even with the mage wind, he could not have sailed clear to the Kargad lands. This islet must be out in the reach, east of Gaunt, but still west of Karago-At. It seemed strange that people dwelt on so small and forlorn a place, a mere sandbar. Maybe they were castaways, but he was too weary to puzzle his head about them now. He kept turning his cloak to the heat. The silvery Pelwai fur dried fast, and as soon as the wool of the facing was at least warm, if not dry, he wrapped himself in it and stretched out by the fire pit. Go to sleep, poor folk, he said to his silent hosts, and laid his head down on the floor of sand and slept. 3 nights he spent on the nameless isle. For the first morning when he woke, he was sore in every muscle and feverish and sick. He lay like a log of driftwood in the hut by the fire pit all that day and night. The next morning he woke still stiff and sore, but recovered. He put back on his salt-crusted clothes, for there was not enough water to wash them, and going out into the gray, windy morning, looked over this place whereto the shadow had tricked him. It was a rocky sandbar, a mile wide at its widest, and a little longer than that, all fringed all about with shoals and rocks. No tree or bush grew on it, no plant but the bowing seagrass. The hut stood in a hollow of the dunes, and the old man and woman lived there alone in the utter desolation of the empty sea. The hut was built, or piled up rather, of driftwood planks and branches. Their water came from a little brackish well beside the hut. Their food was fish and shellfish, fresh or dried, and rockweed. The tattered hides in the hut, and the little store of bone needles and fish hooks, and the sinews for fish lines and fire drill came not from goats, as Ged had thought at first, but from spotted seal. And indeed, this is the kind of place where seal will go to raise their pups in summer. But no one else comes to such a place. The old one feared Ged not because they thought him a spirit, but because he was a wizard, and not because he was a wizard, but only because he was a man. They had forgotten that there were other people in the world. The old man's sullen dread never lessened. When he thought Ged was coming close enough to touch him, he would hobble away, peering back with a scowl around his bush of dirty white hair. At first, the old woman had whimpered and hidden under her rag pile whenever Ged moved. But as he had lain dozing feverishly in the dark hut, he saw her squatting to stare at him with a strange, dull, yearning look, and after a while she had brought him water to drink. When he sat up to take the shell from her, she was scared and dropped it, spilling all the water, and then she wept and wiped her eyes with her long, whitish gray hair. Now she watched him as he worked down on the beach, shaping driftwood and planks from his boat that had washed ashore into a new boat, using the old man's crude stone adze and a binding spell. This was neither a repair nor a boat building, for he had not enough proper wood and must supply all his wants with pure wizardry. Yet the old woman did not watch his marvelous work so much as she watched him with that same craving look in her eyes. After a while she went off and came back presently with a gift, a handful of mussels she had gathered on the rocks. Ged ate them as she gave them to him, sea-wet and raw, and thanked her. Seeming to gain courage, she went to the hut and came back with something again in her hands, a bundle wrapped up in a rag. Timidly, watching his face all the while, she unwrapped the thing and held it up for him to see. It was a child's dress of silk brocade, stiff with seed pearls, stained with salt, yellow with years. On the small bodice, the pearls were worked into a shape Ged knew, the double arrow of the god brothers of the Kargad Empire, surmounted by a king's crown. The old woman, wrinkled, dirty, clothed in an ill-sewn sack of sealskin, pointed at the little silken dress and at herself and smiled, a sweet, unmeaning smile, like a baby's. From some hiding place sewn in the skirt of the dress, she took a small object, and this was held out to Ged. It was a bit of dark metal, a piece of broken jewelry perhaps, the half circle of a broken ring. Ged looked at it, but she gestured that he take it, and was not satisfied until he took it, and then she nodded and smiled again. She had made him a present. But the dress she wrapped up carefully in its greasy rag coverings, and she shuffled back to the hut to hide the lovely thing away. Ged put the broken ring in his tunic pocket with almost the same care, for his heart was full of pity. He guessed now that these two might be the children of some royal house of the Kargad Empire, a tyrant or usurper who feared to shed kingly blood had sent them to be cast away to live or die on an uncharted islet far from Kargoat. One had been a boy of 8 or 10, maybe, and the other a stout baby princess in a dress of silk and pearls. And they had lived and lived on alone, 40, 50 years, on a rock in the ocean, prince and princess of desolation. But the truth of this guess he did not learn until years later. The quest of the ring of Erith Akbi led him to the Kargad lands and to the tombs of Atuan. His third night at the isle lightened to a calm, pale sunrise. It was the day of sun return, the shortest day of the year. His little boat of wood and magic, scraps and spells, was ready. He had tried to tell the old ones that he would take them away, that he would take them to any land, Daunt or Spevy or the Toriclas. He would have left them even on some lonely shore of Carregoat, had they asked it of him, though Cargish waters were no safe for an archipelagian to venture. But they would not leave their barren isle. The old woman seemed not to understand what he meant with his gestures and quiet words. The old man did understand, and refused. All his memory of other lands and other men was a child's nightmare of blood and giants and screaming. Ged could see that in his face as he shook his head and shook his head. So Ged that morning filled up a sealskin pouch with water at the well, and since he could not thank the old ones for their fire and food, and had no present for the old woman like he would have liked, he did what he could and set a charm on that salty, unreliable spring. The water rose up through the sand as sweet and clear as any mountain spring in the heights of Daunt, nor did it ever fail. Because of it, that place of dunes and rocks is charted now and bears a name. Sailors call it Springwater Isle, but the hut is gone, and the storms of many winters have left no sign of the two who lived out their lives there and died alone. And I look up and it's 10 o'clock. So maybe that's the stopping spot we're going to get without reading some more. The Tale of the Two Castaways.